guys, it's Sam, and today I'm going to talk about what I got wrong and misjudged about the romance genre before reading it. This was a video topic that was voted on by my Patreon supporters. Every month my Patreon supporters get to vote in polls for video topics I'll do, books I'll read, we buddy read the books together on Discord, a whole bunch of stuff. So I'll link my Patreon down below and on the screen if YouTube finally lets me, if you want to check that out and get more involved in my content in that way. So I've been wanting to do like a video in defense of romance for a while now, because if you've been watching my channel for years, you will know that like I never read romance books until a year ago. I did not want to read adult romance. I had misconceptions about them, like I'm saying in this video, and I just was very biased against it. And I've seen this attitude. I wasn't like vocally biased where I was like, oh, people that read romance are stupid. Like I was never that person, but there are those people out there, and there was always this like, oh yeah, but I don't read romance. And even right now when I do read romance, if I tell people like in person, I like don't mention it because there is this bias against romance that like I always don't want to get into with people, but I want to get into it today on this video. So the first misjudgment that I had was that romance was formulaic. Romance can be formulaic, and there is a certain formula that a lot of romance follows, but what is so interesting and what's so fun about the genre is how the authors play around within that formula. So for a romance book to be a romance book, it has to end in a happily ever after, or at least a happily for now. The characters are together and they are happy. A lot of people consider that to be like this horrible bad thing, but actually knowing that going into romance books is part of the appeal of them and what makes them so fun, because you have the stress of kind of knowing there's going to be some kind of upset before the happily ever after, but you know they're going to get back together. There's none of this like characters are dying and you're not sure, like you don't have that. And I don't think that that's actually a weakness like people think that it is. The general formula also is like characters meet, something happens, they get together at some level, and then some kind of thing happens that tears them apart, whether that's their own miscommunication, whether it's like an outside circumstance, and then before the end of the book they get back together. So like at the 75% mark was when the breakup happens and then they get back together. Again, I thought that was like, oh my god, that's like so... No. What authors are able to do with that is actually so fun to see, because each genre of romance, each like author has a different way of taking it. Some authors don't even go into like the full breakup. Like I've definitely read books where it's like there's a miscommunication but it's very like easily resolved. Like you get to see so many different examples of how people like in real life do communicate and go through things, and it is like really just kind of endearing to see a couple be together and like go through something and get through it, when we have like reality, you know, like your girl's a couples therapist and is like also an individual therapist, but I see couples, and so I see people and they're bad times, man. So it's nice to see like things work out, you know, because actually in the grand scheme of things, the majority of things in life do work out at some point. I also really always thought, as far as like formulaic, that the romance genre was like one type of thing. Like it was going to be like full of like bad boys, or like in like the innocent women, because a lot of times I had read, before I got into like adult contemporary romance, which is like my favorite genre within romance right now, I had read some like new adult stuff, and a lot of the new adult that I was reading in like 2015, 2016 was like the bad boy, the good girl, like ugh. And you can still find that. But the thing is like I didn't realize how many different subgenres and different tropes and different things were in the romance genre. In that same way, I also thought romance and adult romance was like all sex. No, like most adult romance books do have a sex scene, if not maybe like a few in there. But it's on a spectrum. There are some adult romance books that have no sex scenes, that are just like fade to black. There are some that'll have like one. I generally feel like most romance books have like 1 to 2. And then there's some that have like way more like sexual talk in them. And then there's like erotica that is like all the sex scenes. But those are all different genres within the romance subgenre. And I wouldn't even say erotica, I mean, I guess erotica and romance have an umbrella, but I almost feel like erotica goes more into like where porn meets romance, and that's not what this is. So the fact that it's like, no, just because I'm reading romance doesn't mean I'm going to be reading sex scenes all the time and, you know, bad boys and like macho. No, there are so many different genres. There are, you know, the contemporary romances, there are the historical romances that I think, and this is still my current bias, so I could make an updated video about this, I do see a lot of historical romances that's like romancing the rogue, and it's like the bad boy who, like, you know, the girl is ruined by even being in his presence privately for like a minute, so they have to get married. Like, I feel like that's a very common trope within historical romance, but it's not the only thing that's in historical romance. There is like dark romance with some like bad boy, whatever stuff, bad girl, you know, there's so much, and I guarantee you, if you haven't read romance, there is a genre out there that you would like. There's fantasy romance. Like, I've done other videos talking about like different genres that overlap and that you might be able to find something that you like within that. But honestly, if you haven't given it a chance, I'd say give it a chance. And check out some of the romance booktubers out there, because romance readers are voracious. They read probably more than like any of the rest of us do. And they have so many books that they can recommend in different subgenres. So it's not just one thing. And the formulaic part about it, again, isn't necessarily bad. It's just the same as when we see a lot of like chosen one tropes within like fantasy. My second misconception, even though those were like a few misconceptions all wrapped into one, but my second one was that I felt like it was always going to be bad writing. I think this is also the nature of how we talk about romance books, and I'm guilty of it too. I'm guilty of doing it in this video, but we say like how fluffy and like easy and fun it is, which implies that the writing is bad. And it's not. Like, is there plenty of bad romance writing? Yes. Is there plenty of bad fantasy writing and sci-fi writing and literary fiction writing? Yes. There's bad writing in every single genre. So it has nothing to do with the actual genre. Like, for some reason people feel like, oh, romance is like easy to write, or like because you don't have to build a world, it's like way easier. I wouldn't say it's easier, I would just say it's different, because also like there is a sense of world building to a lot of romance books. A lot of romance books take place in like small towns, or like that's a genre, right? Like, or a trope that you can find. A small town like romance. You have to build a little world and make that like a realistic atmosphere. One of my favorite romance series takes place in like a Ren fair. That is a certain element of world building. Like, there is an element when you are writing in a realistic setting that you still have to build that world and make it feel real and make it feel like something that the characters are interacting with. So there is an element of that doesn't make it any easier just because it's our world. Also, if you've read any other genre that's not romance, you'll know it's not easy to write a romance. Like, it's not easy to write a good relationship. A lot of authors struggle with it. There are so many bad romances in other genres that are just like stuck in there because they're like, people like romance, but they don't actually know how to write it. Like, it's incredibly difficult to write a compelling relationship that gives other people feelings. And the grand majority of the romance books that I read, like, I do like and like feel for the characters. So that is a skill that not every author has. So just like some of the romance authors wouldn't necessarily be great at building a huge fantasy world, a lot of fantasy authors aren't great about writing a romance. Kind of connected to that point and to the first point, I was convinced that there would be unrealistic sex scenes in romance books. And I've actually seen, I brought up this thread before. I've seen a thread on Twitter before about how like, hey, is all the romance in books like unrealistic? And I don't know if people were talking about romance books or all books in general, but a lot of people that were replying to that were like, yeah, sex isn't the way that it is in these books, blah, 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 which is true sometimes. However, the most realistic sex scenes that I've ever read have been in romance books. Yeah, the stuff that happens in fantasy, especially in fantasy that's like medieval based, where I'm like, you know, everyone is smelling bad and like these people don't know what they're doing, and like where are you? You're in the wilderness, like, ugh. But these sex scenes that happens in a lot of especially contemporary adult romance is like very realistic. I've read sex scenes where people are like tripping over their clothing, where people can't get like bras unclasped, where people are falling off beds or falling off like tables, or like something happens, a weird noise will happen. Like, all these things that happen in like real life like happen in these books. So it actually is fairly realistic. Like, yes, sometimes you will have some like over the top like you know what? That's a lie. I don't remember the last time I read a contemporary, especially romance book, where everything went off according to plan in the sex scene. Like, they are all, especially like the newer ones that I've read, are all very like, this is how it happens, man. And it might still be like cute and whatever, but like, it's not just like this fairy tale glossed over perfect scene. So I really appreciate that too, because it's like very realistic, and I think that's one of the reasons that I've actually gotten more and more comfortable with sex scenes in books, because when I first started this whole like romance journey, I was like, I don't want to read about it, I don't want to see it, I don't want to talk about it, that makes me so uncomfortable. But now that it's like I'm used to it, and there's only like a couple per book, it's like realistic and like kind of funny. I've read a number of different authors that kind of have like a funny style with it. It's actually like an enjoyable part of the book, and the writing flows. Like, I especially like romance books where the writing feels the same in the sex scenes as it does in the rest of the story. There are definitely some authors I've read where the writing kind of changes and I'm like, ugh, cringe. But generally speaking, it's way better overall than I thought it was going to be. And lastly, I thought, kind of like going along with like the formulaic, all a certain way, I thought that romance was going to be incredibly shallow. And that, I think, is one of the biggest points that I like totally was wrong about. I have cried or had like genuine emotion over more contemporary romance books than like any of the fantasy sci-fi that I've read. And like the fantasy sci-fi I've read is obviously like much more dramatic and like world ending and apocalypses and blah blah blah, but the realness and the rawness of so much, again, contemporary, because that's what I tend to read, adult contemporary romance, is so like visceral, and not in a way that's like making you cry the whole book or anything, like not even always in sad books, but there have been so many lines in individual books that have just like gotten to me because I'm like, wow, I feel so seen. Like there are so many books that are with like women around my age and like going through similar things, and I'm just like, oh my god. And like the topics that romance books cover, again, it isn't just necessarily all about the romance. Yes, the romance is the main focus, but there's so many themes of like friendship, and especially like female friendship and family, and like building a business or being a career person or whatever the case may be, that I'm like, these are all like so relevant and salient to my life that like a line will happen, I'll be like, oh my god, like this is, you see me, you understand. And like, again, I feel so much for the characters in these books, and it just is not as shallow as I thought it was. I was like, oh, I'm just gonna be reading like a fluffy, cute romance. But even in like the fluffiest, cutest romance, there's still gonna be a certain level of emotion, especially if it's well written. You know, like one of my favorites that I read this year was Beach Read by Emily Henry. That is such like a multifaceted, complex romance book that like I loved the romance, and the romance was like sweet. Would I call it sweet? I mean, yes, like it was a cute romance. I really liked it. They like tugged at my heartstrings, but I also like cried during that book because it's so connected to me, and I connected to the story and what was going on and everything. So it's not shallow just because it's about love. And I think that's my like final point, and the point that I think we all kind of make who are romance fans. There is some blatant misogyny, and even internalized misogyny if it's a woman talking about romance, with the disdain for the romance genre. People look down on things that women like. And honestly, why shouldn't men also like romance? If men read romance books, I think there would be so much, especially straight men, I think that would be so much better for everybody, because it would be like, be in touch with your emotions, here's what real relationships look like, here's what real like thoughts are. There's actually a whole romance book series about that called the Bromance Book Club, where the guys are reading romance books in order to like be better partners and stuff, and not in like a skeezy way. They're like, we're learning from these books. So just because women like it and women like romance and like feelings and emotions doesn't mean that it's like a lesser thing. It's amazing. Like, human beings like social connection, no matter what your sexuality is. Whether you're asexual, aromantic, whatever, there's some level that people enjoy connection of some kind. So romance is like about connection on some level. Even if you're not into like the sex scenes or whatever, that's what it's about. Human beings, every single one, needs social connection. There's no reason why, like, anyone, you know, again, if it's not your style, I'm not saying that everyone needs to read romance. However, I think the disdain that is had for the romance genre is so, like, aren't we past this? Like, it is 2020, like, we have outgrown the disdain for the romance genre. Like, it is a valid genre. Romance, like, keeps publishing alive in a lot of ways because of how voracious the readers are and how much the authors write in it and all of this. A lot of the publishing industry is, like, on the backs of, like, the romance subsections of publishing houses. Like, it deserves way more credit than we give it. And I honestly implore you, if you are all interested, to give romance at least a chance to just kind of see what I'm talking about. And yeah, are you gonna find your first favorite romance book, like the first book that you read? Probably not, but like, it is just as valid as every other genre. And shipping something or liking relationships, whether they're romance books or whether they're not, is not vapid, shallow, or something to be looked down upon. It's just something people like in books, and people like human connection. So that is me on my soapbox. So comment below and let me know if you have read romance books, how you got into them, if you also had some bias against them like I did before you got into them. Comment below and let me know about your romance journey. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.